writing science fiction and fantasy. Yay! You know, this class, sometimes people do cheer, which is weird to me, but not that weird. You are in school, you realize, but hopefully this class will be fun. We're going to talk about writing science fiction and fantasy novels. We'll do some work on short stories. I am less of a short story expert than a novel expert. So the class focuses on this, but a lot of the principles apply to both. We take a very hands-on, practical approach to storytelling in this class. We are going to talk about the nuts and bolts of creating a plot, of creating sympathetic characters, and of world building. These are kind of our four cores, and then we will also talk about the business. Contracts, agents, all of these things. Main reason I do this is I actually took this class in 1999 or 2000 when Dave Farland/Wolverton taught it. And I had taken a lot of creative writing classes, and I felt that a lot of them were very useful, but they tend to focus on this sort of express yourself, learn to explore your style, all of these sorts of things you get in creative writing classes, which is great, but none of them can tell me how to make a plot. Like, how do I make people like my characters or hate my characters? Well, just express yourself and, no, tell me how to make my characters likable. There's got to be a way. And then I took Dave's class, and he took this approach, a very practical approach. And it is an approach that you can really only get from someone who works in the business, which is why I've continued to teach this class, despite having less and less time for it over the years, just because I think it is an important resource. I think you need both. You need to be hearing from people who are talking about the style of writing, and you need to be hearing from people who are talking about the craftsmanship of writing. We focus on craftsmanship in this class. Now, I want to start off talking about something I call the toolbox, the writer's toolbox. My approach to this class is that there is no one way to write a story. This goes back in my early days as a new writer, trying to explore how to do this. I remember reading two different pieces on how to create plots. One was by Stephen King, and one was by Orson Scott Card. Orson Scott Card, in his piece, he said, you know, you really need a great detailed outline. This is what makes great plots. If you have an outline, you know the steps and the pieces going forward, you will have a wonderful story. Stephen King says, never write an outline. They're terrible. They'll ruin your story. If you spend all of your time working on an outline, you'll write the life out of it, and you won't be excited to tell your story, and it's one of the worst things you can do. I'm probably exaggerating what he said, but that's what it read like to me, right? And so, at the end of that, I'm like, so who's right? They both write great books. They're both fantastic authors. They have very different opinions on how you should go about plotting and pacing your books. Well, it turns out they're both right. Every writer is different, and every writer's approach will be different. You will not plot the same way that Brandon Sanderson plots. You might use a style similar to how I plot, but you won't end up using my style. And in fact, my experience has been that every project you work on, you will end up approaching in a slightly different way. For some reason, the feel of that book will be different, and you'd be like, you know, this is a book not to outline, this is a book to discovery write. And authors do tend to fall into these two archetypes, or somewhere in between, most of us do. Discovery writers and architects. George R. Martin calls them gardeners and architects, but discovery writers, outliners, both are tools that you can use. And my goal in this class will be to talk about what these different tools do. To give you a little taste of it, let's talk about these two. This is not a plotting lecture, this is an introductory lecture, but I want to give you a feel for the way these different things work. So, discovery writing versus outline writing. So, let me ask you, people who have not taken the class before, what might be some differences and how these things play out? Discovery writing is what we call pantsing. It's where you sit down, you don't know where your story's going, and you explore it. Outline writing is what it sounds like. You have a detailed outline and know where you're going. Let's say you discovery write. What kind of story might that make? Has anyone tried it out How does that feel to you? Yeah, how does it feel to you?
I failed.
You failed. Okay. How does it feel to you?
It feels risky.
Risky. All right. How about you?
Actually, I kind of felt like the story told itself because I started going and then I was like, whoa, no way. It's just like surprises around every turn.
Ooh, so the story told itself and you found surprises. You're a discovery writer. That doesn't mean you can only discovery write, but the way she just talked is the way that a lot of the classic discovery writers talk, where they're writing their story, they get really excited by how things surprise them, and things like this. So let's go back here in the blue.
Propulsive meandering for me.
Compulsive meandering. Good way of putting it. Yeah, okay. Right here.
I feel like I kind of knew my characters personally. I knew exactly what they would do. Like, I love them. Like, they were my friends.
You got to know your characters really well. Okay, yeah.
Just kind of going along with that, I felt like discovery writing for me was more useful in figuring out who my characters were, having them wander through a market, doing random things.
Okay.
But when it came to the actual story, it felt super disorganized, trying to
Okay.
just kind of go.
So you had these two things. You said, I got to know my characters really well, letting them wander and do things, but the story felt a little disorganized. Yeah. Wow.
It became like a movie in my head, and I just wrote what I saw.
Came like a movie in your head, and you wrote what you saw. All right, we'll do these two, and then, yeah. Oh.
Sometimes I feel like, oh wait, where'd the polar bear come from?
Oh, wait, where'd the polar bear go? Is that a Lost reference? Yeah. Because there was a moment in Lost where you're like, polar bear? Yeah. Hey, wait, where'd the polar bear come from? So you guys described it exactly, kind of where I wanted to go with this. It seems like you're exploring this yourselves. Discovery writing does tend to, number one, there are certain people that this is just the way it works. They get really excited. And it makes a better story. Your goal is to find out what will make the best story for you. You tend to figure out your characters a lot better when you're discovery writing them. But when you're outline writing, your story tends to meander less. You tend to know where you're going. You tend to have a better grip on it. You tend to have a less disorganization, more organization. And these are both different tools. I find that when I'm reading a book, the outliners, when I get to the ending, they usually have a pretty good ending, right? Things come together. Things have been foreshadowed, and you're like, wow, how? That's an ending. That's Ender's Game, right? That's an outlined book. He knew what was going on in that book, and he set up each of the pieces, and then he was able to kind of punch you in the face at the end. And it was great. But you tend to have, unless you're watching for it, slightly weaker characters. And these books that you read, Stephen King's a great example of this. George R. Martin is another. Where you read the book and you're like, these characters are awesome. I don't really know where it's going, but I really like reading about them. And then you get to the end and you're like, okay, so it ended. But the characters were great all along the way. Those tend to be kind of foibles of the different styles. And if you know this, my goal is to let you know what the different styles do, how they can help, how they can hurt, and allow you to kind of create your own hybridized version that hopefully highlights what you like to have happen in your books. For instance, not every book has to have an Ender's Game style ending. In fact, there are plenty of books where that would overshadow the book. There are plenty of books that are about the relationships and how the relationships work. And the fact that the ending is expected is a good thing. There are books where that's not the case, where if the ending is expected, you get to it and you're let down. There are books where a meandering plot and characters not really getting to anything can really ruin the story for you. And so the idea is, can you do a hybrid? What I tend to do is I tend to discovery write my characters and then outline my story once I know who they are. Dan Wells, one of my writer friends, he always does a monologue by one of his characters that's stream of consciousness, discovery written, to figure out who they are in first-person voice, and then that doesn't go in the book. That is his guide to who that character is. The character tells him who they are, and then he puts them in a novel. There are as many different ways to do this as there are writers. And we'll come back to this idea during the plotting lecture. We'll actually do 2 lectures on plotting. We'll do 2 on plotting, 2 on characters, 2 on setting, and 2 on business, and then we'll have some wild cards as well. So, toolbox. There is no one right way to do that. In fact, you should listen to every writer you meet about how they talk about their style, and then you should ignore anything that has to do with this is how you should do it. And pay attention to everything else they say, right? When they tell you their style, you should replace this is how you should do it with this is a way that it works for one writer. Maybe you should try it out. My goal for you in this class will be for you to try these things out. To consistently take a tool, see what it does for you on a given story, toss it aside and try another tool. My goal is that when the writing is going well, you don't have to think much about this class. When the writing is going poorly, when you're not sure what to do, then you go and you say, okay, what were Sanderson's tools of plotting? Maybe I can look at all these tools and try a few of them out and see if they strengthen my story. What are Sanderson's tools that he's for revision? And when I say Sanderson's tools, they're not all mine. They're ones I've gotten from all over the place. Some I use, some I don't. All right? That's the toolbox. And that's the philosophy of this class. Now, this is a class about science fiction and fantasy specifically. If you don't write science fiction and fantasy, I think there will be plenty of things for you to get from this class, and I certainly don't want you to leave. You should write whatever you want to write. But we will be taking some time to talk about science fiction and fantasy things. One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is the nature of what we call genre fiction. In the business, genre fiction means any type of story that fits into a section in the bookstore that is not general fiction. Okay? Which is weird, because the word genre means a ton of things, right? Genre can mean, genre meaning young adults versus middle grade. Genre can mean science fiction, fantasy versus this. It can also mean plays, novels, short stories, whatever. But in the industry, they use the term genre fiction. I'd like you to be aware of this idea of genre. Not because I wanted to pin you down into anything, but it is a market reality. But something I've been thinking about lately is genre fiction and how it relates to tropes. What do I mean by tropes? What are some tropes of fantasy? Tropes of fantasy, right here.
Hero's Journey.
Hero's Journey, trope of fantasy.
Unbreakable or unbeatable sword.
Unbreakable or unbeatable sword.
Wise old wizard.
Wise old wizard,
Orphan
yes.
hero.
What's that?
Orphan hero.
Orphan hero, yes.
Mentor always dies.
Mentor always dies. And people wondered how I called Harry Potter. Yes.
Animal companion.
Animal companion, yeah, definitely. What about science fiction? Tropes of science fiction.
It's off the charts.
It's off the charts. Its power level's off the charts, yeah. What's that?
Humans are innately evil compared to never mind.
Oh, humans? Like no, right. There is this trope where it's like the humans are the every alien species has their thing. They're like the wise Vulcans or this, and then humans they're just people. Whereas aliens aren't people. Something like that. Yeah. What else? Tropes of science fiction.
Powerful evil empires.
Evil empires. Both of them do evil empires. Yes.
Conquering planets or trying to conquer humanity.
Yeah. Aliens show up and try to conquer us, right?
Spaceships breaking down.
Oh, yes. Yes, Mal Reynolds crawling along with the piece that he has to use to fix, yeah.
Race wars.
Race wars, very big, yeah.
Advanced technology.
Advanced technology, there you go. So, you guys know what the tropes are. One thing to understand is that though people sometimes are dismissive of our genres because of their tropes, there's nothing wrong with tropes. In fact, tropes are useful tools. Don't be slaves to your tropes, but understand they're useful tools and understand that there's a reason why some of these things are very popular. You're going to have to find your own balance between how much you use of a trope and how much you try to invert the tropes. The thing to keep in mind and remember is that tropes do not equal fantasy and SF. And this is a mistake that a lot of people make. The tropes are not the science fiction and fantasy. Science fiction and fantasy includes the tropes. For instance, elves. Having elves in your book makes you a fantasy. Being a fantasy does not mean you have elves. And people try to go the other way. What does make science fiction and fantasy then, if it's not the tropes? Tropes are useful tools. But what does it mean to be fantasy and science fiction if we're saying that the hero's journey does not make something, using the hero's journey does not mean it necessarily science fiction fantasy. Those two are not interchangeable. What is? What makes it fantasy or science fiction?
If it's awesome.
If it's awesome, okay, I like that one. Over here.
If it's not like set in our like everyday normal world.
If it's not set in our everyday normal world, that's a very good way of putting it. We'll go right here.
Wonder.
Wonder, sense of wonder, excellent.
Speculative.
Speculation, yeah, speculation about what could happen.
Not in the scope of reality.
Not in the scope of reality. These are all great answers.
A lot of times there's a chosen one or fate of the world.
Okay, chosen one, fate of the world, I would put as a trope. I wouldn't say that defines science fiction and fantasy, although I'd say much science fiction and fantasy has it. Definitely. Yeah, go ahead.
Supernatural elements.
Supernatural elements. So, science fiction fantasy. Keep in mind that the things we just talked about, wonder, that's what's drawing us here. Fantastical elements, that's what's drawing us here. As writers, your job is to boil these things down. Your job is not, the common person can say, you know what, vampires are what urban fantasy is. Urban fantasy is vampires. Where your job is to say, why do people like reading about vampires? What is the part of that story, if I boil it down, that makes that story successful with its audience? You have to dig deeper than the trope. You have to ask yourselves the why of each of the tropes. And that way, when you're putting them in your book, when you say, when I'm doing the chosen one, I want to write a story with this, the question is, why? Beyond it being awesome, why? What am I gaining from this? What is it doing to my story? And what sort of emotion is this going to evoke in my readers? You need to dig deeper than the superficial. That's your job. People ask me a lot, why science fiction and fantasy? I actually had a book signing once where this woman came up to me after her daughter got a book signed. And she said, no offense, but the only thing I can get my daughter to read is the science fiction and fantasy crap. How can I get them to read Chaucer? They legitimately asked me this, and so I talked to her about this. People ask me this. So I was actually in Sharjah, which is the United Arab Emirates, last spring. Part of why you got your final late, because I had to fly to the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you.
You got it. So I'm in the United Arab Emirates, and they have a distinguished literary professional there. And we're having sort of a roundtable discussion that turns into a debate where he says, yes, but fantasy and science fiction aren't literature. You can't seriously tell me that science fiction and fantasy are literature. He is mistaking the trope for the genre. What makes us fantasy and science fiction is not the tropes. And perhaps he doesn't like your kind of traditional quest fantasy. I would argue that these are literature, but maybe he doesn't like them. And let's wait a minute on those, Donald. Let's wait a minute on those. But he's making this mistake. Why do I write science fiction and fantasy? It comes down to this. Science fiction and fantasy can do everything that any other genre can do. You will find fantasy and science fiction with the literary styling of the great classic literatures. You read Ursula Le Guin, or you read Gene Wolfe. You read some of these people who are known for their literary styling. You'll find a romance in science fiction fantasy that can be every bit as powerful as the best romantic fiction. You'll find mystery. You'll find adventure. These genres are not bounded by what they can contain. In fact, they are the only genres that are not bounded by what they can contain. The reason I write, read, and love science fiction fantasy is because it is the genre where you can do all of this stuff. You can be literary, you can have action adventure, you can do all of these things, plus you can have dragons. So why not, is my opinion. Why not write the genre where you can include anything that you want to, where you can be whatever you want to be. That is what our genre is. It is the genre of whatever you want it to be. And you might, in this class, want to write like Ursula Le Guin and Jane Wolfe. If so, I commend you. Go for it. Do it. You might, instead, want to be writing something that is fast-paced, sarcastic, amusing and, kind of kick you in the face-ish. Go for it. Write whatever you want to write, and that gets me here. What should you write in this class? Words are good, usually. We're at BYU, so certain words. I'm joking. No, what should you write in this class? My suggestion to you is that you treat this class like a fresh start to something. That you set aside whatever you were working on before, and that you start something brand new. And through the course of this class, you try to write what the workshoppers are going to write. They're going to be required to write 35,000 words. Now, you whistle, that's not like NaNoWriMo. They have like 3.5 months, rather than writing 50,000 in 1 month. It's still pretty rigorous. It's a lot of writing. But I would suggest that you try to do this. That you try to write a couple thousand words a week. If you write a couple thousand words a week, maybe around 3,000, you'll do that. You'll go over it. 3,000 words, for most people, is about 6 hours of writing. Most people write around 500 words an hour. And that's kind of everyone is different. You shouldn't use this to be like, oh, I need to get to that, or oh, I'm too fast. You should find out what your writing speed is, and you should kind of learn what is working for you and what isn't. But most people, around that. That's 6 hours a week. If you're serious about being a writer, 6 hours a week should be a pretty decent goal for you. If you want to become a pianist, you would say, I'm going to practice 3 nights a week for 2 hours, if you really wanted to do that. Or I'm going to take 6 hours on a Saturday and really drill into my writing. Hard to find the time for all of this. Now, I do want to say, in this class, I'm taking the perspective that you are going to be a professional writer. Many of you probably aren't. You probably don't want to. You're here to be like, I want to learn how to write that book that I've been thinking about writing forever, Brandon. I don't necessarily need to make this my career. I'm pre-med. I'm doing pretty well in that. Anyone pre-med? Okay. Hey! Good job, saving all of our lives. My mom wanted me to be a doctor. She told me, she's like, you know how doctors all go golfing all the time? Well, you could write books while the other doctors are golfing and still have a real job. I love my mom. She's an accountant. She's yeah. She's wonderful. But she really, really worried about me. I'm going to pretend that you want to be a professional. And I think during the course of this class, you should pretend that it's okay if you don't become a professional, if that's not your goal, if that's not your ambition. Don't let anyone make you feel bad if you just kind of want to do it for fun. You've got this weird thing in our society, don't we? Where anyone here go play basketball, like, once a week with friends or at the, yeah, right? You go play basketball, there's like the ward basketball or whatever. You go play basketball. Nobody, when you get done with that, is like, so, when you go to the NBA? No, they understand you go play basketball because it's good for you. Because you enjoy playing basketball for a few hours a week. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, everyone would probably laud you for going out and exercising and doing something like that. It's good for you. Writing, I view the same way. If in your head you're like, you know what I want to do is I want to have the literary equivalent of playing basketball 1 night a week. I want to spend 2 hours a week or an hour, whenever I have the time, and work on a story because it's good for me, because I enjoy it, because I want to have things for my friends to read. Never feel guilty if that is your goal. Never feel guilty for choosing writing as a hobby. And don't let people say to you, so, when are you going to go pro? When are you going to earn money from this? As if earning money from it were the only reason it has any value. I was at a party once. It was soon after I had hit the New York Times list for the first time. I'm at this party and a friend introduces me to someone. And this someone says, what is it you do, Brandon? I said, well, I'm a writer. And she said, oh, so you're unemployed. Which you will get. It will happen. Learn to let it roll off of you. Don't get mad. In this case, I vindicated all of us by saying, actually, I'm on the New York Times list right now. Bam! One of those moments you just wait for, right? You've done it your whole life. And so, don't feel guilty if that's what you want to do. Let me get that aside. But, if you want to write professionally, one of my jobs is to tell you that you can. When I took this class from Dave, I had heard all of my life, writers can't make money. Writers, that's not a real job. Writing is just not something that real people do, right? It's this far off thing. And then I met Dave. And you know, Dave, the thing about Dave that was impressive was, I knew who he was, because I was really steeped in fantasy. But if you walked to the average person on the street and said, do you know Dave Farland? No. They wouldn't know who Dave was. If you walked to the average person on the street and asked them who I am, they won't know who I am. The average person knows maybe 5 or 6 writers. I met Dave, a person that most people on the street would not know, and he was making a healthy living as a writer. It is totally possible. It was possible then, it is possible now. It is not guaranteed. That's what people meant to say. When they do this kind of dismissiveness, what they mean to say is, ooh, that's dangerous. Because it is. It is a risk. To become a professional writer, my instinct is you'll have to spend about 10 years of your life dedicating to yourself to this, writing consistently every week. 6 hours or more is what I would suggest. You need to be producing a novel a year, or you need to be of the style of person that's more like a J.K. Rowling or a Pat Rothfuss, who rewrites one book a bunch of times. I don't get those people. They're weird, but it works for them. Either way, you're going to have to be honing your craft for the next 10 years, most likely, to get a chance that the job is going to pan out. That's risk. It totally is. What I'm telling you is, those chances after 10 years are much better than people think they are. People tell you it's a 1 in 1,000 chance. It's not a 1 in 1,000 chance. My class that I took with Dave, there are 5 of us out of 22 who are professionals. Okay? I was in that class. Dan was in that class, who is a professional. Eric James Stone was in that class. His first book came out a couple weeks ago. Peter Alstrom, who is my editorial assistant, was in that class. He went on to a career of editing at Tokyo Pop. And Kaylin is in that class, who's in my writing group right now, who has written a number of novels and had offers and things with New York. That's 5 people who are professionals. And of them, 3 of us are full-time. There probably could have been more. The thing about that is, of those 5, 4 of us were in a writing group together. Okay? And then Eric became a quick friend and is now in my writing group. So, people in this classroom will become professionals. I've had at least one basically every year, usually a couple, who eventually go on to publish on a professional level in science fiction, fantasy writing, or in editing. There will be people in this class who do it. The chances are not nearly as bad as you think they are. But you still have to take 10 years and gamble. So it is wise when my mom said, you may want to think about a backup. Yes, that is wise. But you can do it. It is real. It is an actual thing. Another guy in that class went on to become a tech writer. Okay? Ethan. He did technical writing for years. He used his English degree in a real way, right? My friends who are in the computer industry, guess how often they've changed jobs? My job has been more stable. I haven't changed jobs a single time. Granted, I hit the lottery. We will completely be upfront about that. You know, you can't gamble on becoming what I have become. But you can do it. All right? You can do it. And the people I know who've been writing consistently across a decade, even if they're not selling tons of books or things like that, they love writing, their books have gotten fantastic, and they're having a wonderful time with this advanced hobby, so to speak. It is totally something you can do. Be aware of that. So, both sides. Something you can do, something you don't have to do. All right? Pretend while you're in this class that you want to do it full-time professionally in the next 10 years. Because that's how I'm going to treat you. Adapt it to yourself once you're out of the class. Does that make sense? All right. So that's using this class. The last thing that I want to talk about before we do a few questions is workshopping. One of the tools I want you to have in your toolbox is being able to workshop. Okay? Knowing how to do a workshop, how to be part of one, and things like that. Some writers do not like workshopping. For some writers, they are just awful, and they get out of their workshop, their writing group, as soon as the class is done. That's okay. I want you to try it, because in my experience, what did I say about those 5 people I know from that class who are professionals? How many of them were in a writing group together? 4 of us. So what happened is, one day in class, I said to Dan, "You're a pretty good writer," because he'd done a reading in class. Dave had people do lots of reading. I said, "Do you want to do a writing group?" He's like, "Yeah, sure. We should get some other people together." And so we founded a writing group in that class and started it off together. Years later, I was at a convention. Both Dan and I were really looking at publishing. Peter was really looking at becoming an editor. Dan met an editor at a party. He came and got me and said, "Hey, me and Peter are talking to this guy, and he's an editor at Tor Books, and he's awesome. You should come be part of this conversation so you can meet him." We went and talked to Moshe, who became my editor, for like 2 hours at this party. We both sent him things. He rejected Dan's and bought mine. Yes. But a couple years later, Dan wrote something that was really spectacular. I called Moshe and said, "Do you remember that guy that you met with when you first met me? He's just written the best book of his life. You should take a look at it." Moshe took a look at it and bought it, and then Dan got published. Right? This happens a lot. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, we're in a writing group together. You get these little enclaves where you can help each other out, and you can network, and you can share stories, whether you're self-publishing, going traditional publishing, hybriding. It is a useful thing for most of us to have a good network of other people. Kaylin, in my writing group, she said, she told me once, she probably would have given up years ago if she hadn't been in the writing group with us and seen our success and had to turn something in every week. Some people need that deadline, right? If I don't turn in something every week, my writing group is going to know, and then I'm going to feel guilty, so I should write my stories. Her stories are amazing. She got an offer from Tor on her books, but then Moshe vanished off the face of the earth. So that's why you can't buy Kaylin's book yet, but it's still kind of working in that realm. Get a good writing group, and it will do a lot for you. But you need to do it the right way, all right? So there's a couple things to be aware of with writing groups. Writing groups will try, without proper conditioning, to ruin your book. They'll do their best without proper conditioning. The problem is, the biggest problem for writing groups is when discovery writers workshop pieces of writing that are not finished yet. If you're a discovery writer by nature, or you have some of those inclinations, or you're just leaning that direction for a while, or whatever, you write this piece, you turn it into a writing group, and then the writing group's like, "This is great! What if you did this?" Has that happened to you? Has that happened?
I hate it so much.
Yeah, because then you're like, "Oh, what if I did that?" Oh, and suddenly your story goes, and this cool romantic comedy you're writing suddenly, has an action sequence on the Empire State Building or whatever, and you're like, "Ah!" And then someone else the next week's like, "It'd be great, dragons. You're writing fantasy, why aren't there dragons?" And suddenly the character's a dragon writer too. And you get all these ideas in your head, and people try to hijack your story, and you end up kind of writing to the wrong audience, writing to this crowd of writing group people, rather than staying true to the vision of your story. That's most dangerous for discovery writers, but it can happen to any of us. So there are a few rules to put in place that will help. Number one, when you're workshopping, If you're the one giving advice, and that says workshopping, I'm sure you can all read that. Try to be descriptive instead of proscriptive. What this means is, you are looking for, as a reader, places where you're confused, where you can say, I was confused here. Not places where you can say, I know what you should do. You should add an action sequence right here so I'm not bored anymore. Adding the action sequence is prescriptive. Saying you're bored is descriptive. Now it's a fine line to walk, because the best editors, prescription is what they do. That's why you need a professional editor, because they get another look at your book, they look through and they say, you should add an action sequence in right here. A good editor knows the type of book you're trying to make and is helping you make a better version of that book. When an editor says, you should add an action sequence right here, what they're saying is, the style of book you're writing, the audience is going to start to feel like they need something here, and an action sequence is going to help build the tension the way you want it to be built in the type of book you're writing. The writing group member, without as much experience, might just be saying, I would put a action sequence here, and this kind of book is just boring to me. It'll be much better for her if she has more action sequences in her Jane Austen novel, I'm sure. Even though you don't think that exact words, that's what's happening, is you're trying to turn the book into the way you would do it. So, descriptive versus proscriptive. Try to be in this realm, much more than in this realm. Okay? Really try to do that. Try to do things like, I really like this character. Make sure you, by the way, do the positive as well. That says positive. I don't have much patience for writing on the chalkboard, which I don't even have. The blackboard, white, this thing. I don't have much patience for that. It's mostly to keep you all from falling asleep, though usually my well-projected voice does that. Stay positive. That doesn't mean that you don't give criticism, but in my writing group, we make sure to go down a list of positive things in a piece before we get to what's really bothering us, okay? What this does is it tells the author what they're doing right and prevents them, in revision, from taking out the good stuff. Saying, I love this character's voice. That's really useful. Or, I laughed out loud at this part. That is extremely useful. Now, also saying, this joke fell really flat to me, and it was cringeworthy, that's useful too, right? The author needs to hear that. The other thing that you want to keep in mind, though, is that you should discuss. Discuss. Yeah, that says discuss, I think. You should discuss, meaning if somebody says something, says, I was really bored on page 2 with this part, and that was a part you liked, you should jump in and say, actually, I really liked it. And then have a discussion, not an argument, a discussion about what's working, why it works for one of you and why it doesn't for another. That's really useful, because oftentimes one of the ways that writing groups can go wrong is pet peeves. Somebody in the writing group will mention something, and it will become a big deal to the writing group, or in your head as the writer getting workshop, when 99% of people wouldn't notice it. It just becomes this thing that the writing group talks about a lot for whatever reason. And so you should feel willing. People who've been in writing groups are like, yeah, oh yeah. You should be willing to discuss, and you should be willing to offer your opinion, your objection. If 3 people think that a joke falls flat, then that's really useful to know. If 5 people laughed at it and one is like, I thought it was cringe-worthy, you probably want to keep the joke, because there's not a given single joke out there that everyone's going to laugh at. Does that make sense? The other thing that you need to learn how to do is to drop it. Meaning, when you have a pet peeve about a story, chances are that, it might be something the author wants to change. But they're going to be submitting this book to you over and over and over again, and they may be working on chapter 20, and you've offered this criticism on chapter 2. And that means even if they change it, you have 19 or 18 more chapters or whatever to deal with this thing. Just drop it, all right? Learn to be able to say, I've had my piece about this element of the story. I understand that the writer has heard what I have to say. Let's leave this aspect alone, all right? Now, if you are being workshopped, workshop E. You're the workshop E. The number one thing you can do is be quiet. Shut up. That means when you're being workshopped, you should avoid saying anything. Anything at all. Don't defend yourself. Don't explain yourself. Don't do anything. The main reason for this is treat your writing group like a test audience. Right? They do this a lot for movies. Right? They'll have a group in, we'll have them watch the movie and see what they have to say about the movie without, trying to defend the movie. They just want to see what people thought. This is why at the end of Empire Strikes Back, the Millennium Falcon didn't blow up, because in the first draft it did, in the first movie. You guys know that, right? Totally blew up. And all the test audiences were like, oh, that's totally a downer. We hate this movie. So like, oh, maybe people like the Millennium Falcon. We'll have it not blow up. We will avoid killing the only black guy in Star Wars. And they changed it to the ending we have now. They do this a lot with commercials. In fact, what they'll do with commercials, it's really clever. They have people come in for screenings in Hollywood of new pilots they're planning to show, new television shows, and those will have commercials. The actual focus group is about the commercials, but all the people there think it's about the movies, the three pilots. They do this to keep them from being too biased. If they tell them, we want you to talk about our commercials up front, you tell them that, then they're going to be too focused on it, they're not going to be natural. Instead, they have them watching, apparently they've been using the same ones for like 18 years, or something like that. You see these same pilots with new commercials. And then afterwards, they ask you questions about the pilots and say, oh, by the way, what commercials, do you remember which commercials we're in? And see what works. This is what you're trying to do. You're trying to get a feedback like this. You're trying to get this kind of, you're the fly on the wall, watching a discussion about your book. And when the writing group is working and the people are doing this, they're being descriptive, they're being positive and negative. You do want to get into things. They're discussing all of this stuff. You can just be taking notes, saying, okay, this is working. They're confused at the right place because I'm going to describe this in the next chapter, and so it'll be a nice counterpart to them wondering about it in this chapter. Or, oh, they were supposed to get that by now. I should make sure that this is explained in future drafts of the book. That is your goal in the writing group. It is not to convince your writing group that you're a great writer. I know you all are. I know that it's really painful to hear them discussing how something didn't work when you're like, but no, it's brilliant. If I could just tell you it's brilliant, then you'll know I'm brilliant. The people who like my books least are my best friends because they read the bad versions, right, of my books. In fact, I've had people in my writing group, Alan, who's been in it for years, he read one of my books that I hadn't workshopped in the writing group because I just had run out of time. He read the thing, he came back and said, I forgot that you're a good writer, Brandon. Because he had only ever read first drafts for like the last few years. That's what he'd been reading. So you just have to throw the writing group to the wolves and understand that they're not going to get your perfect stuff, and maybe they'll read it afterward and it'll be great. Don't defend yourself. Don't argue with people in the writing group. On occasion, at the end, you can ask questions if you want something explained more, but try to let them talk first and then ask some questions at the end. This is very hard. You 15 that are in my workshop, I'm going to make you do this, okay? I'm going to watch you in writing groups, and if you talk, I'm going to be like, no talking. But the rest of you, run the writing groups how you want. What we do in my writing group is we do it once a week, in person. I like writing groups in person. I don't like Skype writing groups. I like once a week because I, from the get-go, was like, I'm going to be a professional. This is what I want to do. And so I put people in my writing group who wrote as much as I did. That was the goal. I really have never found anyone who actually writes as much as I do. Maybe I can go back in time and be with Asimov. But I wanted people who could consistently submit every week a chapter or two, so that we could actually have things to discuss and dig into. In your own writing group, you may want to be like, we each submit every other week, and there's like 6 of us, and we do 3 pieces a week, because we're not crazy like Brandon. You might want to, but you want to have a writing group where you're consistently all kind of on the same page, would be my suggestion. I'll get to the question in just a second. Where you all kind of are writing at the same sort of level. At the very least, maybe have a couple of every other weekers and a couple of weekers, if that makes sense. That's what we actually do in my writing group is Kaylin and me. Dan moved to Germany and then hasn't come back yet. But Kaylin and me submit every week, and then 4 other people actually kind of alternate, so we have 3 or 4 submissions every week. What was your question?
If you are a descriptive writer, or
Yeah.
like if you're going by the seat of your pants,
Yes.
how do you deal with writing groups that need that?
I would suggest, if you can, write an entire book and then workshop it while you're writing something else. Does that make sense? If you're in the 15, you're not going to have that luxury. But most discovery writers I know, this works until they get a real handle on their style and what they want to do with books. Kaylin, she's a discovery writer in my writing group right now. She can write something and submit it. And she can keep the writing group from knocking it off the rails. At the same time, we've workshopped a lot, so we know, we're like, oh, this is the type of story you're trying to write. Let's help you make a better version of that. And if you as a discovery writer can be like, this is the type of story I'm writing. I'm writing this, and the class will help you decide that. These are my goals. These are the things I'm approaching in it. Then you can learn to dismiss which writing group comments would send you off down that weird path. Does that make sense? In a given writing group session, I will usually take about 1/3 of the comments that are given and make changes according to them. And those 1/3 are usually really important things to be changing. So it's still very useful to me. But it's not like what everyone says I do. Sometimes I'm like, even though everyone else says it's wrong, I'm like, no! I want to do what I want to do. So, all right, let's go to other questions. Anything you guys want to know about anything I've talked about here, or the structure of the class, or things like that? Yeah?
I'm curious if you think a book sort of like Stephen King's Green Mile would fall under the category of scientific fantasy?
Would Green Mile, Stephen King's Green Mile? Well, as I understand, the prisoner can see the future, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would totally put that. The thing is, it's whatever you want it to be. Science fiction fantasy is whatever you want it to be. Here's the thing to remember. Every book, every fiction book, and even if most nonfiction, are creating a world. Now that world might be Regency, England, and the rules of that universe might be that people are nice to each other for the most part, and if they aren't nice to each other, bad things happen. And in the end, the guy and the girl hook up. That might be the rules, but you know, that's a Jane Austen novel. Those rules they're almost fantastical. Right? Not quite, but almost. You get to define what your book is. We'll talk about, most of the bookstore genre descriptions and things. These are marketing descriptors. And so once you have your book in hand, my suggestion is write whatever you want to write. Get the book in hand, and then decide what to do with it. I often joke that when I'm the artist, when I have on the artist hat, when I'm writing my book, I don't think about market at all. I think about writing the most awesome, incredible book that I can write of that style that I'm trying to write. Once I'm done, I lock the artist in the closet, I grab the manuscript, and I run away cackling, and then I find every feasible method of exploiting that as possible in order to get more food for the artist so they can go do their thing, right? I think that's a good way to start thinking about it. Write the book you're passionate about. Usually what I suggest to people is this. Write what you wish were out there, okay? Find the whole, right? Don't just write what you've seen before. Write what you wish the things you'd seen before were doing that nobody is. With me, I was like, I love epic fantasy. I feel like, this was the late 90s where I was getting into this. I'm seeing the same story over and over again. That's getting kind of boring. I'm seeing 2 similar worlds, the 2 similar magics. And so when I sat down to write, I'm like, all right, I'm going to use what I love, but I'm going to find the home. I'm going to write these really intricate magic systems that when people go, they're like, I've never been in this world before. That's what the whole was for me. Find what yours is, right? Find what the things you're loving to read aren't doing, and do that. But yeah, Green Mile, sure. Other questions? Yeah.
When it comes to world building, how does discovery versus outline writing, how do they differ? Because I feel like your characters are products of the community in which, I mean, like as we are products of where we
Right.
come from and whatnot. So if discovery is focusing more on like your characters and outlining is more on your plot, how would world building fit into either?
How would world building fit into the difference between discovery and outlining? So discovery writers will often not do a ton of world building ahead of time, and they will world build along, and they'll have these instincts where like, you know what? Religion's probably really important to this character. So what are the religions? And then they'll stop and they'll world build it a little bit. Put it in their notes file. They'll explore it maybe on the page before they even put it in the notes file and see if it works. And then they'll stick it in the notes file. That happens very commonly. There are plenty of discovery writers who are like, I'm going to do a big world, and then I'm going to set someone in it and see where they go. That's perfectly acceptable as well. One thing to remember for those of you who are discovery writers, one of the things that helps a lot is to understand that discovery writers are basically writing their outline as a draft of their novel. The best discovery writers, the way they mitigate this whole plotting thing, is they write the whole book, then like, okay, now I know what my book's about. And then they go back and they revise, or even put it aside and write it from scratch again. That's the extreme method. Or they just revise, now knowing what their ending is, and using the first draft they wrote as an outline. Where discovery writing goes wrong is when they write a chapter, and then they write the second chapter and say, oh, I know what my story's about now. I'd better go fix that first chapter to match my second chapter. And then they revise the first chapter, and then like, ooh, I came up with some cool things. I'll revise my second chapter to now match the first chapter. And then they're like, oh, but now I know who this... And so you get this loop where you're always revising these same chapters, and each version is so different. It could be like 17 different beginnings to different books. That's where you get in kind of this feedback loop as a discovery writer that can be very dangerous. You need to finish things. Finishing things, even as a discovery writer, you won't know until you're done with your book. That's a really good skill to get in the habit of not abandoning the story, but keeping on going.
So with the project that you suggest doing for this class, like I have an idea for it, but I'm an outliner.
Yeah.
And I haven't done a ton of brainstorming at all on this particular idea. Would you suggest just like going at it, like, okay, I guess I'll write a first chapter?
I would suggest doing what you want to do.
Okay.
Trying a chapter if you've always been an outliner. So the question, I repeat them for the camera just in case. The question is, you've always been an outliner, you've got an idea, in this class you're like, should I spend time brainstorming or just go for it? Just going for it once in a while is very useful if you've never done it. And seeing what you can learn from discovery writing. But if, for instance, the class, the official 15, I'm going to give them a week before they actually have to turn in something new. The submission for next week can be something they've worked on before. And so you can give yourself a couple weeks to get going. The danger for outliners, I erased it. Outliners have a danger of what we call world builder's disease, where they say, I can't start my story until it's perfect in my head or on my outline. And so they spend the next 20 years, Professor Tolkien, working on this perfect world. And if you're Professor Tolkien, you can go ahead and do that. And then they never actually write their book. Now that's fine if you're like, you're a role player, and you're like, I just want to build this cool world for my friends to role play it, and I'll eventually write stories in it. No big deal. But if you want to be a professional writer in today's market, you need to complete a book a year. That's what your goal is going to be. 1 book a year. If you can do 2, that's even better. But at least 1 book a year. If you spend 20 years world building, you're not going to have a book for 21 years, probably. So you need to learn to speed it up and to focus your world building on what's useful to you. And during our world building lectures, we'll talk about that. Okay? All right, let's do like 1 more question if there is one, and then we're going to break to go split up to writing groups and things. Well, last question, all right.
If you're not quite sure if you're a discovery writer or an outline writer yet, I think I'm an outliner, but I'd like to ask, if you write an outline and you just plan on it being somewhat flexible,
Yeah.
it's basically a weak skeleton, and then you just discovery write it, and your outline changes, is that too dangerous?
Is it dangerous to change your outline or kind of have your outline as a weak skeleton? No, in fact, almost every outline writer I know uses the outline as a changing skeleton. I'm pretty outlining, and my skeleton changes quite a bit as I'm going. I know very few writers who don't change that outline as they go. It's a very natural process, and so there's very, very few. Kevin J. Anderson is one. He sticks right on his outline. But there's very, very few of us that are that far over. I would say most people that are a discovery writer or an outline writer, it's like 75%, if 50% is half and half, or 25%. They're like, they're a discovery writer who does the Robert Jordan method, which is, I have points on a map. I know I'm going here, 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 and this is my ending. And then I discovery write my way here, discovery write my way here, discovery write my way here, and then go to my ending. And that's kind of like a 25%er, right? Or they're an outliner like me that's a 75%er, which is, I create a very flexible outline. I discover my characters as I go, and I then change my outline as I'm going and always rebuilding it. But I'm an outliner because I keep that outline going, right? I rely on that outline even though it's changing all the time. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to split. Those of you who are in the lecture but not the workshop who want to be in a writing group, Isaac is willing to split you into writing groups. What you should decide before you start putting away papers and shuffling as happens, you should decide how often you want to be submitting. About a 2,000 word chunk. So to this writing group. If it's like, I can do it every week, he's going to put multiples of you together who will do it every week. If you're like, I can do that once a month, he will put more of you, like, 8 or 10 instead of, 3 or 4. Probably not 3, but like 4. So that you have 2 submissions every week that each of you submits, once a month or something like that. Does that make sense? Decide how much you're going to do, and then kind of decide what genre you're in. It is good to kind of put some YA people together, some people who want to write epic fantasy, just so you have at least one other person in your writing group who reads actively in the genre that you're writing. So if you're doing YA or middle grade, or if you're doing hard science fiction, it's good to have another scientist in the group. Does that make sense? So Isaac will kind of try to split you up. He will also give ad codes. He will do that first, so hang out for writing groups until he's done with the ad codes. He will give ad codes to everybody who wants to add the lecture class or audit it. The 15 of you, meet me out there. We're going to go to another room and we'll talk some more, okay? Thank you guys very much.